Alrighty, so as promised, here are some additional things where people ask a couple of questions, either a little bit later or I didn't manage to put them in. So I'll go through them, and this is the quick list. I will start with how to create a lava lamp and working with glass. We will actually do glass in our 9th session, so I will only touch it kind of roughly today. So, how to create a lava lamp. For that, we would start with, well, the general shape that it would have. And for this, I will actually start with a spline. So I would go to the front view, I would use the B-spline and maybe create, it's usually something like this, probably. And then a little bit like so. I don't know. I would think it looks something like this, right? Kind of. I will use this as my main reference, and I will now create the separate parts that it's made off of. So usually we have like a closed top and bottom, and the glass is only in the middle. So I would just create... No, it's snapping. That's a little bit annoying, but it's okay. So I will just create... No, that's not okay. I will just create the shape a little bit lower here. So we have this. 1, 2, 3. Then we have the cap. Here I will need a couple of points to get the curvature right, but it's something like this. Then another one, maybe I just start it this way, and I don't have the snapping issues. Almost. There we go. Okay. And then we have the part that connects the two. So it is something in here. Then we go out, in there, and something like this. Okay, now we need to perfectly align certain elements. So these points here need to be exactly in the center. Then here, these need to be exactly in the center as well. This should probably be straight, the same as this, and sitting on the floor. Something like this. And here the same. Top should be straight, and bottom should be straight as well. Now I can use my revolves, or my lathes. I need 3 of them. And now I have my basic objects here ready. What's wrong with the top one here? Oh, this point is not exactly in the center. There we go. The rest seems to be working fine. Good. Okay, so now that I have my basic shape, I can think about what is on the inside. And for this, I will just, for now, take my lathe 2, which is the one in the center. And in the basic coordinates, I will just tell it, in the basic tab, I will tell it to be X-ray so I can kind of see what's inside. Now I will start with spheres, and I will put them into a cloner. And I will tell the cloner, however, to be linear. And maybe it's going up, maybe not at all. Maybe I just keep it at 0. So I'm creating a couple of clones, let's say like 12. And I place them in the center here. Now, what I can do is, I can go to here, to the random effector, apply to the cloner, and in the parameters, I can tell it how far it should stretch these elements. Now I will use 1 to change the position, and I will use another one to change the size, because what I can do is, with one random effector that is just set to the position, would also work with the scale, but I don't want them to animate their scale. We can go to the random mode and switch this to noise. Then we tell it to be indexed, and when we now play this back, we have this nice effect. So we can play a little bit around with the animation speed, so maybe something like 20 pixels makes a little bit more sense. We can also play around with the scale to have a little bit control over some sort of seed to kind of control them moving differently. And in the parameters, we can now start to fine-tune where they should go. Of course, we should not overdo it, but a little bit on the X and the Z, but not too much. I don't want it to be peeking through anywhere. So kind of like that, probably. Then we can place the cloner either inside of a volume builder, smooth it out and use a volume measure, or what's probably a little bit faster with the performance is using the metaball. So here we drop the cloner into the metaball and we change the editor subdivision maybe to 5 centimeters and increase the hull value until we have something like this. And now we have these nice things that are randomly going into one another and merging and whatever. Now, lastly, I just want these dots to have a random size so it looks a little bit more natural. So with the cloner selected, we just add a second random effector. And here we only change the scale proportionally to something like this. So we have some smaller dots and some larger ones. There we go. Now, when it comes to the rendering, we want to first make sure that we have some sort of environment, something that needs to be around it. And I think the easiest solution for that is I will just add a very quick floor and use an HDRI. So HDRI Haven, and let's take something indoor, maybe something that has a little bit more detail. Well, let's take this one. There should be enough detail to see in the reflection. So whenever we work with materials like glass or metal, it's always important to have something that reflects, because if there's nothing in the surrounding that can be reflected in some way, well, we don't really see what the material is made out of. So let me import this real quick. And I will pipe it into the luminance channel and put it on the sky. Now, when I render this, even though this looks transparent, it will not be rendered transparent because, well, I didn't tell the material to do so. So we need to create a material for this. For this one here, in theory, we would have multiple layers. We would have a glass layer and then a layer with the initial liquid in, that is not the colored one. But in the end, the refraction index that we would get is just the same as water. So I will make my life a little bit easier and just tell this to be no color, because glass usually doesn't have a color. It just is transparent. And here I tell it that it should be refracting like water. Then in the reflecting channel, as always, remove the default specula, and the transparency already gives it a proper reflection layer on top, which is great. Now, this is the material that I need to apply to the glass inside here, and from now on I can also turn off the X-ray, because by default it will already have the X-ray enabled. When we now render this, you can see how it nicely deforms our elements inside because of the refraction that we gave to this element. And it works nicely with our background that we have there as well. Now, if we did not have a background there, so if I just use a regular white material for the sky, for instance, then this would look completely different because there's just nothing in the background that it could show. It's basically just white, and that is kind of lame and not really what we want. So always make sure when working with glass that you have a surrounding that, well, works properly. Now for the material that we have there on the inside, we could work with transparency, but this can take super long to render. I would try to see if it works with SSS. Now SSS also takes quite a long time to render, It's called subsurface scattering. But what it does is it calculates how light passes through an object. So let's just see what this looks like. I turn off the reflectance for now, and I will go, maybe I'll also disable my glass thing here, so just so that it renders for now a little bit faster and I can see what this looks like directly without anything around it. So as a color, I will give it the color that I want it to have. So maybe I will make it kind of like a greenish color. Then I will go to the luminance channel, to texture, and I will choose under, where is it here? Effects, subsurface scattering. And you can already see that it's kind of like filling up the object, but in this case right now with just this white color. So here I will choose it rather to be a greenish bluish color maybe. Now for this, it's depending on how large our element is. So if I have a larger path length, it passes through the object for a longer distance. If I have a shorter one, it passes through shorter. So this is something like skin probably, then we have something like wax, and well, the longer it gets, the smoother overall it can look. Okay, so this is a value that we just need to play around with and see how it reacts on our object. So I would apply this to the meta ball, and when we now render this, you can see how it's not just applying this color, so this is without the SSS, and you can see how the backside here is kind of, well, dark because it's in the shadow. But if we have light that passes through, let's also see what happens when we add just another light from the back. Where's my Z? Here's my Z. Something like this. Let's make this fairly soft. And now let's turn on the luminance. You can now see how the light hits the object and it kind of passes through. And let's go to an area where we have something that is thicker and thinner here. And let's also see what it looks like without this guy. Maybe there we can see it a little bit better what it does. Yeah, so here you can now start to see how this behaves on the element. We, however, need to play around with the path lengths a little bit more. There are also different kinds of presets. So maybe something like milk might not be a bad place to start. So we already have a path length that it suggests. And then we just adjust it to our own color. But it also uses these ones here. But no, it's starting to do something. Let's also see what it looks like if we just drag this a lot higher. I don't feel like I see that much of a difference in here. I think we'd rather keep it a little bit shorter, so we have this nice effect of the light passing through. Then we also have a couple of other options in here, but I think, which one was the one? I think we don't need a fast evaluation. See if this makes a difference. Oh, this just takes a lot longer. But it doesn't really make that much of a difference. No. Let's keep this there. So I personally am not a big fan of the subsurface scattering in Cinema 4D, so that I don't use it that often. I use it with other render engines, but it still gives us a little bit more of a pass-through look. Anyways, lastly, we also want this to reflect, so let's give this a GGX and a dielectric Fresnel, so it looks a little bit more glossy. Maybe I also make this a little bit darker. I think this needs to be a lot darker. It's very flattish. Or is it rated a little bit darker? And maybe in here also use something like this. Yeah, now we're getting somewhere. Okay, then we can turn this back on, and maybe this has kind of like a dark gray cap that is not so reflective. To reduce the amount of reflection, you can either play around with the IOR. So you can see the less I do, the lower the value is, the less reflection we get. Or you can just play around with the overall layer opacity, which might be a little bit easier to control. And this I now apply to the two lathes that I have. And here we go. We have our nice little lava lamp. So the next question is how to do flags, and another question about glass. But as I said, in our next session, we will talk about glass a little bit more in detail. So let's go for the flags. Now in Cinema 4D, I think the reference that was sent along with the flags question was a little bit more like paper that was a little bit crumbled. So I'm not 100% sure what was meant by flag, so I will just show some related things. Thing number one. We could always start out with a plane, move it up a little bit, and we can work with cloth. So we would need something that it could fall on top of. So this could be our floor. Unfortunately, whenever working with cloth, we need to make things editable because the cloth module is kind of old. But let me show you how it works. For the plane, we can keep a very low resolution like this. So I just make it editable, right click on it, go to simulation tags and tell it to be a cloth collider. This one here will then be our, well, regular cloth. I will create a duplicate of this and save this. So I just disable it because I want to play around with the subdivision. So first I will keep the subdivision as is. Then I will go to simulation tags, cloth, and when I now play this back, it will fall down and it will almost behave like cloth. But of course, everything is super perfect and super flat. So let's see what happens when we just rotate it around a little bit. Yeah. I hate the cloth module. 1 second. Do I need to disable it or something beforehand? It's really annoying. I personally hate working with this. So here you can see how it's now falling down. And now it already moves a little bit more like we would expect it to. But it's still a little bit too solid. And that is because we don't have enough subdivisions. So let's now see what it looks like if we use a plane that has a higher subdivision. So let's already rotate this for the next one. And let's try something like 50. And we could also say current state to object. And on here, we will then say simulation tags and cloth. And now let's play this back. And now you can see it's starting to behave a little bit more like we want it to. So we are getting these ripples and it behaves a little bit more like we think cloth would behave. Now we can, on top of this, see if we can make it behave a little bit more like a regular cloth. Seriously, it just doesn't let me move things. How disappointing. Oh, and now it destroyed it completely. Yeah. So this is one really annoying thing about the cloth module. It can destroy your geometry so that you cannot go back to what you had before. So sometimes undos are working, but sometimes even that gets messed up. So always keep a copy of your original element before you apply the cloth thing. So what the cloth module can work with is in here forces, and we could use, for instance, a turbulent force. And let's try something here, scale like this. And let's just see how it behaves. When I, of course, apply my cloth. And now you can see it's starting to get somewhere. I think I don't want it to slide on the floor so much because I do want to keep the wrinkles that it has. So let's see, what could we try? Where is that option? We have a bunch of options here, how it interacts with wind and stuff like this. But I think, don't we have an option for, let's enable the self-collision as well. Ah, here, friction. Let's drag this up to 100 and on the floor here as well. Let's see. Because of the self-collision, it takes a little bit longer to calculate. But now we can see how it is sticking a little bit more to that shape. Let's see. It takes me too long to calculate. Let's just go back here and say self-collision off. Then it calculates a lot faster. Can we increase the friction to something higher than 100? Unfortunately not. That is disappointing. I would love to have this a little bit higher. But let's still see. So here. Where was it again? In here. This was already high. This I think is fine. Okay. Now let's see what happens if we increase our turbulence strength. I think the size might be already okay. I can see a little bit of stuff going on. Maybe I'll drag it a little bit higher. And then I drag this quite a bit higher in the hopes of it affecting my object a little bit more. There we go. Now we're starting to see something. Let's try 100. Ah, this is already a lot better. Let's try something more like 80. And now let's see, this will obviously take a little bit longer to calculate. When we go back here and say self-collision, and we will use the cache option so that I don't have to play this back. Because now it will calculate here. I don't have any playback issues, and then after it's calculated, I can just scrub through and look at it in real time. Okay, so now I can scrub through here and I can see I have some nice cloth falling down and creating these cool wrinkles on there. Okay. And now what people then often like to do is kind of like put this onto a wall. Now this is a little bit too wrinkled, but I'll just stick to what I have here. I would give this a little bit of thickness and smooth this out. And Cinema has a specific surface for that, so the cloth surface. We've in the past only used this in order to give something a thickness, but when we add subdivisions here, it just add subdivisions that look a little bit more like cloth would. We can compare it. So let's just take the plane out, delete the tag, and by doing that, we are essentially merging this as just a final geometry. And if we put this into a regular subdivision surface, you can see how it behaves very differently. Although I actually feel like I like what the original subdivision surface is doing more. We also have a factor here. Nope. I think I actually like what the original subdivision surface is doing quite a bit better. No. So sometimes in some cases it feels like we are adding details that we want to, but well, as you can see, sometimes it also doesn't really look better. I think this looks a whole lot better. Okay. So let's kick this and only work with this one. Because we started with our element here at the top, it doesn't behave like a, or the anchor point is not what we want it to, so we want to center it to the object. So Shift-C, and we say center axis 2. And now our axis is where the center of our object is. Okay. Alternatively, right now I can also see how the rotation is a little bit messed up. We can go to the axis mode and tell this object, based on the world, to be rotated on 0, and I think also the Y position. Let's put this on 0, because that way we always know when this is placed somewhere where the axis is, then it fits exactly onto the floor the way that it should. Make sense? Maybe. I hope so. So let's now just put this into the center of the world and place it into a subdivision surface. Okay. Now, to render this to look like it's kind of like on a wall, what we can do is we can just take this together with the plane that is our background, or we can just create a new plane to keep things slightly bit more editable. What am I clicking here? Okay, so these two selected, then we can rotate them around. Our plane obviously should be a little bit larger. And what we could do is maybe give this a little bit of thickness. So we put this into a cloth surface, but we don't use the subdivision of the cloth surface. We only use it to give it a little bit of thickness, like this, as you can see, just a little bit, so that it sticks onto the surface and it doesn't, or onto our wall. Okay, looking good so far. Then let's put something on there. I don't know. What happens if I look for poster? Do I find something that looks like a poster that I could use? Perfect. Let's just take this one. So let's take this and apply it to the subdivision surface. And apparently I want to rotate this around and stretch this a little bit. For stretching, we can either stretch it like so, or what I would prefer is stretching it in the object mode, because that way we can always go back here and reset it back to the original stretching that it had. So I think it just needs to be a little bit higher to match the texture that we have. Then in here, obviously, in the reflectance, because it's paper, I will give it a GGX reflection, dielectric. So even paper reflects, but it should not create this glossy reflection. It needs to be a whole lot, well, less sharp. So let's increase the roughness here to something really, really soft, something like this. So it should still reflect things around it, but it needs to be very, very subtle. Okay, then for this, I think I will keep it fairly simple. Let's just see what happens when we use the physical sky. And let's make sure that shadows are previewed. So our sun is with the sun there. Oh yeah, this already looks like a nice angle for this. And let's render this. And now we have this nice wrinkled paper effect where we can just put any texture onto it however we want to. There's one more nice thing if we are talking about real flags that you could do with cloth. We could attach elements together. So I could create kind of like this pole, and I can take a plane like this. I can adjust it in the size a little bit, like so. Make it editable, and I can select all of the points that are on the side here, and I can lock them. So I right-click on it, go to Simulation Tags. I think this needs to be editable as well. Simulation Tags, and I will say, is a cloth belt already here? Exactly, and then I tell it what the belt is. So this object, I need to say set to connect these two together. Now let's see if this is already working. I haven't done this in a while. Then we tell this one to be cloth. And when we now play it back, it should... No! What else do I have to put in here? Belt on. I really thought it was an object. Or is it a selection? I did click the set function, the set button. Let's see. Because we usually see they're usually colored. Why is it not doing it? Okay, give me 1 second. So apparently I first had to define it as a cloth object, and then on the belt, so when we hit set, it connects it over to the object. It also doesn't hurt if our object has a little bit more polygons to work with. And now when we play this back, we can see how this is kind of like falling down and behaving a little bit more like, well, a flag. On top of this, we can then add wind by going to simulate, forces, and we use the wind that blows into the Z direction. So this way. And when we now play this back, we can go in here and increase the strength. And now you can see how we have a flag that is working in the wind. We can also give it a little bit more turbulence. And again, when we have an object that has a higher subdivision, we will also get a smoother result. So here I could also use the subdivide option, which then destroys my belt. So let's just select these points here again. Set. And when I now play this back, we can see how we have a lot more detail in here. And apparently the turbulence is a little bit too much for it then. Okay, but then we have a nice little flag here where we can then do the same thing as we did before. So we place it into a cloth surface, realize that maybe the subdivision is not too nice. We only use it to give it a little bit of thickness. Obviously, put it around the plane. There we go. And then we place this entire thing into a subdivision surface. And now we have a nice animated flag here. Okay, let's go to the next one, shoe modeling. So, for some reason, I'm not quite sure why, a lot of people want to do shoes. But it's not really something that is easy to do in an application like Cinema 4D or any other regular 3D application because of the kind of shapes that you would want to create. So most of the time people work with either files that they've gotten from a CAD application, which is used for anything that has to do with industrial design, because they build things not based on polygons, but based on paths. So there are certain things, certain products that are really hard to recreate in 3D with a clean geometry, because they are built in other applications that have a completely different way of building things. So it is definitely possible to build a shoe, but it's just a lot of manual work, and I personally would never do it. Like if I had to, I would start probably with getting, I would create a photogrammetry version of the shoe, so taking pictures and then using an application to create a 3D model out of those pictures. Then we can use that as a reference, and then we can start creating our own topology on there, so we can paint our own polygons on there. But this is a very advanced thing to do, so if you're interested in stuff like that, then the key points that you are interested in are photogrammetry and read topo. So creating a new topology on a higher resolution mesh. And then of course there are many applications that can do these kinds of things, but we can also do this with Cinema 4D. Not the photogrammetry, you need another application for that. But if you look for photogrammetry tutorials, there are also free applications to do that. We'll find a bunch of things, and tutorials for retopo, specifically in Cinema 4D. There are also a lot of nice options there. But it's very, very, very time consuming and it takes a lot of practice. So the question is it worth it? Next, we have fur. So Cinema 4D has a so-called hair module. The hair module, however, also gives us a feathers object, which is awful, and a fur object. But the fur object is essentially the same as the hair, but with less options. So even when I create fur, I usually prefer to use actual hair. So what can we do with this? There are so many things that you can do with it, so I also recommend watching some tutorials. I will just give you a very quick rundown. For instance, I think in my video I talked about using hair to add geometry to it, but here we will use hair just as hair. So first I will define a shorter length of the hair, and I want it to be applied to the polygon area to have a little bit more control. And I will, regrow and reroute. So I have something like this to work with. Let's also give this a couple of more segments so it looks a little bit smoother, which of course, because my segments have changed, messes this up. So reroute, regrow. There we go. This looks a whole lot better. Okay, now I can style this a little bit. Also, we've seen this in our last session. So let me go to hair tools and just comp it a little bit. I can also define my sphere here as a collider object, and that should help me. I'm not sure if I could also define this in the tool. That should help me with, where is it? Hair tags, hair collider, which would help me with this. I could of course also hit the play button to play this back, and I can see how this hair falls on there, but I want to kind of like brush it myself. And here, let's enable collisions. Because when I now push this, yeah, it stays on my object, which is kind of nice. So let's pretend that this is now my super beautifully combed hair that I want. And maybe I just push everything away from the surface a little bit. And I think it's the straighten. Yeah, because with this I can straighten it back up. And there, just straighten it a little bit just so that it's not exactly on my surface anymore. Now, when rendering hair, we could do it with a physical renderer, but I've noticed that it's extremely slow. So I usually prefer to use the standard renderer. We lose a lot of other options there, but our render time will be much, 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 much faster. So let me just create a very quick light here. So an area light that targets my sphere. Let's move this somewhere over there. And of course, tell this one to create an area shadow. And then we have one light over here. And let's duplicate this and use the lighting tool to create another light somewhere over here. Okay. So we have a light set up like so. Let's maybe make the other one blue, just to make this a little bit interesting. Okay, when we now render this, you can see how it is filling in hair. So it's not using each guide and it will create one hair per guide. It will actually create a whole lot more hairs in between the guides. And it's doing that based on the amount of hairs that we are defining here. So the more hairs we are generating, the more hairs we will get there, and the more realistic it will probably look. If I have something that is too little, then it of course renders a whole lot faster, but it also looks, well, a whole lot worse. So in here, there are also a bunch more things that we can do. Let's actually make this a little bit brighter. Let's try 150. In the hair color, we can define what color it should have at the root and what color it should have at the tip. But we can also tell it to use the color based on the surface color. This means that we could create something like this. Let me first put it in the luminance channel so we can see a little bit better what it does. Use just a regular noise, apply to the sphere. Make sure that in our previews we enable the high quality noise preview, and then I will make it a whole lot larger and I will increase the contrast a lot. So I'm essentially just creating a very quick cow texture, something like this. Now, because I don't want this to emit light, I will take this, copy it, and I will paste it into my color channel. Let me also turn off global illumination for now. It should render a lot faster this way. And when I now render, oops, I cannot see anything yet because I need to tell this object to look at the surface and use the color. Not illumination or shadows, just the actual color of the surface. And then this brown color will be completely overridden, should be completely overridden. And if it's not, fuck her. I've never had an issue with this. Do you want to be a polygon object? There we go. You want to be a polygon object. Okay. So now we can see it is using the color from the surface of our object here. Now to make this look even better, let's also enable the interactive render region, so it just automatically continuously recalculates what we see in here. It's not really the best thing to do, but it's nice. I don't have to continuously hit Command R to render it again. So one thing that we always want to do is add a little bit of randomness to the length, because all the hairs right now have the same length, but obviously that's not something that we want. So let's go to our length, enable it, and give it a little bit of a higher variation, like 50%. We can also use this to control the overall length of the hair, but for this you could of course also go here into the guides and just make the guides shorter. However, it might mess with the structure, with the style that we gave it. So if I want this to be a little bit shorter, maybe the cleanest solution is just go in here and make this shorter to maybe 50%. Now we can see we have something that is a little bit shorter, but now I can start to see that apparently my hair is a little bit too thick. I probably need to make it a little bit thinner and then add a bunch more hairs. So in the thickness here, I would make this maybe half as thick, 0.5 and 0.05 here. Then it looks a lot more detailed, a lot nicer. But of course, I also need a bunch more hairs. So here, let's do twice as many, 100,000, which of course will also always affect our render time. But it definitely looks a little bit better. So for the final render, I might even go to 150,000. But for now, I keep it this way. Then in here, we can go also into the frizz, which is something that I really like, because this just gives the hairs individually a little bit of randomness in the direction where they go. And now I can see how it just breaks up everything, and it looks so much more fuzzy and so much smoother and nicer. Then this hair looks also extremely clean. And normally when we have hair, it starts to go into kind of clumps. And these clumps are, well, added with the clump option here. So when we enable it, we kind of define, well, there are a bunch of options. Usually the default is already quite nice. You can see how it's starting to clump things together. What I often like to do is I like to increase the clump in the percentage. So let's take something like 80, because then I can see what this radius actually means. So here, now you can see how it's taking a bunch of hairs and it's just spiking them together. Of course, we don't want it to be this much. But here we can now see what the difference is between, for instance, 40 and 200. So do we have very, very small clumps, or are our clumps overall a little bit larger in size? Actually, I feel like this is not doing exactly what I expected it to. Let's see what if we do this. This has no effect at all. Well, Cinema, thank you so much. Very helpful. Or was it the limit? There we go. It's the limit. It was not the radius. I Haven't done this in a while. Yeah, so let's make them just a little bit larger. Let's see, 200 maybe. And then obviously not as much. We just want to get a feeling of it. We don't want it to be as strong. We just want this little bit of feeling of having these clumps just to make it look a little bit more natural and softer, and like there's a little bit of fat in there. So just to now compare, this is without the clump. Super smooth and super straight, which can also be nice. But just adding this clump to it makes it look a little bit less dreamy and artificial, and a little bit more fluffy and realistic. Now there are also a bunch of more things that you can do with bend and curl and twist and stuff like this, but these are the basic settings that we want to use for here. Now, just to give you a comparison of how long this takes to render and what it looks like, let's also add a little bit of a sky, and let's see what happens if we enable our global illumination again. It should take quite a lot longer to calculate, but it might look a little bit better because the sky is lighting up these areas here as well. Yeesh, the denoiser does not work well on here. Let's disable it. And I think I would want to use a sky that is pretty dark. So let me just turn this off. And here I will just use something like 33% for the sky. And I don't want it to see in my render. So I'll go to render text, compositing, and not seen by camera. So when I now render, it starts from the center, and it's looking okay. Now, the disadvantage of using the standard renderer is that the anti-aliasing is just awful. So what we would want to do is go into the options in here, anti-aliasing here, and choose best instead of geometry, which will, however, also drastically increase our render times. So let's just do a quick render, not save this. Then we will do another one with this set to best. So let's give this a second. I mean, this render speed is kind of okay, and we can still see what this looks like in the end, pretty much. Now with the higher anti-aliasing, it will take a lot more time to calculate, but it will also look a lot better. And then lastly, I will render it one more time with the physical renderer. So I will quickly fast forward this. Okay, so now this rendered, and it took quite a bit longer. So 20 seconds, 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Now let's do the same thing, but with a physical renderer. Now you will already notice that we will get this quick preview as always. Oops. We will get this quick preview as always. So first it does some hair clumping and whatever. It's creating the hairs, and then it will do the quick preview. But you can already see how this takes quite a bit of time, because in the standard renderer they use a special function to render the hairs, so it's a little bit independent from the rest, so it can render faster, but also less accurate. Here in the physical renderer, each and every hair is its own object, so it takes quite a bit longer to calculate all the bounces of the light and the shadows and everything to be calculated on these many objects. I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of objects here. Well, hundreds of thousands of objects. And this then, of course, takes quite a bit longer to calculate. So let's just wait for this to go through to compare it, how it holds up with the others. Okay, so now here we have the end result, and we can see how this looks very different. I also went ahead and changed my black to a dark gray, because when I started rendering I noticed how my blacks are just losing completely. So here you can see it's just black. Here at least I got a little bit of light reflection on there, but with a more realistically rendered hair it just lost it completely. So remember, don't use a pure white. This is still a pure white. And don't use a pure black. It will look a lot better in your renderings. As you can see here, as we compare the two, we just get a lot more detail in there. Now, with this, you also realize how each hair is casting its own shadow, so it looks a lot sharper and more defined from the background. And there are different ways of fixing this. Of course, the best option is to use thinner hairs and more hairs, but that would increase the render time even further. So let me show you a little trick that I like to do in Photoshop. For this, I will just be lazy and copy this, and I will switch over to Photoshop. Don't mind what I did there. And I will just paste it in here. Then I will convert this into a smart object, duplicate it, go to Filter, Other, and we use the high pass. Now with a high pass, you might have already used it in the past in order to make something look sharper. So you would go here and then you would use something like overlay, soft light would work as well. Oftentimes it's actually used together with hard light. And you can see how with this, we can really get this sharpness on there. But this is exactly the opposite of what I want. I actually want this to look smoother without blurring it. So here we simply invert our image by going to the invert adjustment layer and alt-clicking between the layer and our high pass. And you can now see how it's inverting the high pass and thereby giving us almost a blur effect. Now here, let me just switch this to overlay, open this up, and, oops, not open this, I like this. Open the high pass and play around with the values here. And you can see how when we are at a value of 0, how it already is affecting my image a little bit. Well, definitely affecting the image a little bit. But I can just make it a little bit smoother and glowy. Like in the parts where it's completely black, unfortunately doesn't work too well, but at least it softens my hair just a bit. And usually now when I look from further away and I compare it, this is what it looked like before, and this is what it looked like after. It already looks a little bit smoother. Another option, instead of this, what I like to use, is an effect. I don't remember where they placed it. I think it's probably under render. No. I will find it. Stylize? Oil paint. Because what oil paint does is, it finds strokes in our image. Let's set this, not to preview, but let's just go in here and look at this here. So it finds the direction at which the hair is going and it just strokes it along. So we get these really nice smooth lines. And here usually I set this value pretty high so that the different hairs are really merging together on top. And let's play around here with the cleanness. Yeah. We definitely want it to be more on the higher side, so we really get these long, smooth, soft strokes. And what about the bristle detail? Don't really see that much of a difference. Yeah, you can also play a little bit around with the light here, but it's just a very subtle difference. Doesn't change the overall look. Now that we have this, it looks a little bit comic-y, but it's fine. I usually add this just with transparency on top. So maybe something like 50%. So my opacity, I set to 50%. And now if we compare this, before, it looks, well, super, super sharp. We have these almost pixelated edges in some places, but with this enabled, it just smoothes everything out and it just looks a little bit more fuzzy and furry, but we don't really see the actual lines that the oil paint is generating. So it just lays on top and it gives it a nice smoother look. So we pretend like we had more hair, more stuff that lays in between one another, just to optimize the look a little bit. Okay, but to also compare the render time, here we can see the standard renderer took 2 minutes and 30. It didn't give us a quick preview, and the physical renderer took quite a bit longer to calculate. However, it also looks quite a bit better. So this already, like when you saw it the first time, you probably were like, oh my god, this looks already so cool. And so fluffy. But when we then compare it with our final result that we then now have in Photoshop, there are worlds between this and this one here. So in the end, I would always go with a physical renderer to render my hair. Of course, also all the rest of my scene will look a little bit better. But it takes a very long time to render, especially when we have other things in the scene. So for just getting the general look, the first ideas of what this will look like, I always switch the global illumination off, and I switch to the standard renderer. And I even keep the anti-aliasing to geometry because it still gives me a good enough preview. I can still grasp what it's doing, and it renders very, very quickly. So I'm fine with that. I can definitely live with it. Okay. That was the hair, or the fur, to be more specific. And I think then we just had the realistic eyes. Now for this, usually people either use pictures or they paint the eyes themselves. And with these eyes, it's mainly about it's mainly about how you apply the texture. And then it's just our general Fresnel on there. And of course, we always need a proper surrounding for it. What's wrong with my Google? So what you need is a texture that looks kind of like this. So we have the eye in the center, then the white part, and then some veiny things on the sides. And it needs to be quite large. So we need a lot of space around here. So this is too close. This is definitely too close. This will also not work too well. So rather something like this, that should work well. Also make sure that on the eye itself that you use, you don't already have reflections, because you wanted to use the actual reflections that we want to have in our scene later on. So something like this should work just fine. It looks very aggressive here with this stuff. But I think this should work well. So let's see if this is a model that I can just grab. I mean, this preview, does it look? Yeah. Ooh, nice. Can I just save this? Or is it this weird Google? No, it's a JPEG. Perfect. So, and let's go to Cinema. Let's just create a new object, a new thing. I will use a sphere, and I will apply my texture. And by default, this looks very weird and kind of stretched, because this is not based on the UV layout that our eye has. So what we will use is, or what I usually like to use is shrink wrapping, because this one projects it from the top and then it wraps it and merges it at the bottom here. And then we will go to the texture mode and we just move this around to kind of define where the focus of the shrink wrapping is. So with this, I can pretty much, well, tell it how large the iris should be. Or pupil? No, pupil is the black one, right? So something like this. You could, of course, also work with a flat projection, but the disadvantage there is that if the eye looks a little bit more to the sides, we don't have this continuous flow of the texture here on the side. Now to make it already look a little bit better in our preview here, what I like to do is go to the viewport and tell this to have no scaling, but of course, you know, in the final end result, it will be smooth either way. Let's increase the segments here a little bit, so we have a nice, smooth and round eye. And lastly, to see what it looks like with reflections on there, we use something on our sky. So let's just take this one here again. And on the eye itself, we get rid of the default specula, add a GGX reflection, and tell it to be dielectric. And now you can see how we have these nice reflections on the eye. So let's take it and with the model mode, rotate it around a little bit, like so. And we can also add our own reflections on top of that. So let's create an area light. Make sure that it's casting shadows as always, blah, 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 blah. Let's move it a little bit to the side. Use as the target our eye. Oops, what am I doing? Target and the eye. And let's use the light here to move it a little bit around. Now, in order to see the actual reflection on this, on the eye here, what you want to do is go into the light source under details and make sure that over here it says not show in specula, because that's the fake light reflection, but show in reflection. And now we can see the actual light source here. You can then either fake to make the reflection a little bit stronger, or what I usually prefer is telling the light to have a physically accurate fall off. Then we adjust the fall off of the light to be roughly the same size as our light. So something like this. Let's make the light overall a little bit larger and further away. And then we give it the correct brightness by increasing our intensity here. Okay, and now we have a realistic reflection and behavior of the eye. Now, if you want to build like a really photorealistic eye, there would be a lot more stuff to do, because there's actually this additional layer on the eye, and this stuff here is not round, but it's actually flat. But I think that kind of kills the simplicity of what we have here. And I mean, this already looks pretty good. If I now render this, it should also look quite nice. Right now it looks weird because GI is not rendered in our scene, but when I now render this, the surrounding here is lit up by the HDRI that we have, so it looks nice and bright. Alternatively, if I don't want to render this with GI for, whatever reason, we can also fake it in this case by turning off the global illumination and creating a light and telling this one to have an ambient illumination. Because with this, we just fake a light source that is essentially nowhere. So here we already have a nice preview of our eye. However, this also kind of like destroys our render in the end. So when I render this, you can see how the shadow just does not look realistic. So if we have something that is as abstract as just having the eye, then instead of using GI, using an additional light that you just set to ambient illumination is a nice solution. But since we have an HDRI, it will always look better with global illumination, even though it renders slower. But when we now render this, you can see how we have a realistic behavior of the shadow on our floor. Okay, I think that should be it. Yeah, realistic eyes. And I've talked about everything. Nice. In our next session, we will talk a little bit about dynamics. It's already our last session that we have, the actual class session. We'll talk a bit more about glass, and we will talk about dynamics. Okay, that's it. I hope you had fun with this second part as well, and I've covered all the basic questions that you guys had. Have a nice rest of the weekend, and see you next week. Bye!